This BizNews production is brought to you by Brenthurst Wealth, a multi-award-winning, truly independent boutique wealth manager. Invest better with Brenthurst.
Well, it's been 5 years since I first addressed this audience, and at that time it was on the back of the longest, harshest lockdown in the world that had just been loosened up a little bit, and a mask mandate was still in place. Can you remember those days? And so I was looking out over a sea of heads, not faces, as I am today. And as the slides were rolling behind me, detailing the facts and figures that proved that the COVID phenomenon was a complete and utter scam, one by one, those masks started coming off. It was an audience reaction, the likes of which I don't expect ever to encounter again, and a very rewarding one at that. But today I'm hoping to see some metaphorical masks come off and to enjoy the same level of engagement with you afterwards. So buckle up, hold your seats, here we go. Socialism, although it can be argued to entail many things, it is properly defined by extensive ownership of assets by the state. Ownership of an asset can, of course, arise from an instrument like a title deed or a share certificate, or from some other mechanism that enshrines a right to the income stream that an asset generates, such as a tax. On that primary yardstick, nations all over the world, but especially in the West, have been socialist for a long time. In most developed countries, governments now supervene over more than half or almost half of the formal economy, and no mechanism is in sight to prevent their relentlessly expanding ownership. Perhaps because this socialist trajectory is in part, I believe, a structural consequence of large-scale democracy, we can observe that it has emerged at a very impressive pace. Just around a little over a century ago, those same countries had tiny public sectors accounting for less than 10% of the economy. Now, as predicted by the soundest economic theories, with a burgeoning state, real per capita income has real per capita growth has dwindled to zero, and inequality has soared all over the place. For the last half century, there has been no growth in middle-class income, zero. One of the greatest feats in the history of marketing was convincing people that socialism had something to do with powerful workers, something to do with power for the people, or that it was to do with the people controlling the means of production. As slogans go, workers of the world unite was an act of extreme marketing genius, but entirely false. It was a complete scam, and no coherent schema for articulating how power would be vested in or exercised by workers or the people has ever been put forth. And so I would like to make the point today that socialism can and should only be characterized by the extent to which the state owns assets and income streams, and the degree to which political power is centralized and markets are distorted by state intervention. Workers and the people can never play a meaningful role in the system. Now, when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, anyone predicting that by this yardstick that I'm proposing, merely a few decades later, the countries of the West would be more socialist than Russia and China would have been mocked and scorned. But that is indeed what has transpired. Finland is now more socialist than Russia. The purpose of this talk is therefore to explain how this tragic and very foreboding situation has transpired. A jarring fact, one that people don't like at all, is that socialism was founded and promoted by the bankers of the Anglo-American establishment, not for benevolent or philanthropic purposes, but to further their own interests. This seems entirely implausible to some. Why would these arch-capitalists bay for socialism? But elite control of governments has been a permanent feature of life everywhere throughout human history, whether one lives under a democracy or a monarchy or tyranny. Through lobbying, media control, infiltration, and bribery, elites have long been able to capture and control governments. And as governments increase in size, the rewards for capturing those governments increase too. Because banking has long been a transnational enterprise, the notion of the sovereign state is, like the notion of socialism being for workers, largely illusory. If you are an elite seeking control, it's far easier to get government to confiscate private assets, bringing them under your control for free, than it is to generate sufficient wealth that would be required to buy them on the open market. So socialism offers financial elites an enormous bounty. The actions taken by transnational bankers to bring about this situation over a century and a half are not a matter of speculation, but are instead documented in excruciating detail, in some cases even by the very institutions they formed. Alec, I took your advice to heart, and I ran the text of this talk through Anthropic's Claude, and it only had minor quibbles with me, which I was happy to correct. Now, the fact that these matters of public record that I'll lay out here today aren't spoken about in mainstream media, because it itself is under the tight control of those same bankers, might mean that you do not know about them, but your not knowing about them does not mean that they constitute a conspiracy theory. That term was a catch-all devised by the CIA to divert attention away from its now broadly accepted role in the assassination of JFK. So it's a bit childish to use it in a pejorative sense. Picking a starting point for the kind of complex phenomenon that I'm discussing here today is somewhat arbitrary, as nothing happens without prior cause. I may nonetheless surprise you by choosing as my starting place in this story South Africa in 1891. This was when Cecil John Rhodes formed the Society of the Elect for the purpose of extending British rule throughout the world. As ensuing events would make clear, British rule didn't mean rule by a monarch or government or the people of Britain, but by the international financiers behind the Society of the Elect's founding. Chief among the founders were Lord Natty Rothschild, Lord Alfred Milner, who was soon to become High Commissioner for South Africa, Governor of the Cape Colony, and a director of Rothschild's Rio Tinto mining company, Alfred Beit, who you would know from the name of Beit Bridge and who was the founder of the British South Africa Company, a landlord who's kind of forgotten these days, but who was very prolific, called Abe Bailey, and he was from Cradock in the Eastern Cape, and Reginald Balliol Brett, what a lovely British name. He was an advisor to Queen Victoria. On the other side of the Atlantic, no doubt by complete coincidence, just 2 weeks later, J.P. Morgan founded the Metropolitan Club of New York, and he was a Rothschild representative too, with links to that family that were half a century old. The Metropolitan Club's members included New York grandees like the Vanderbilts and Roosevelts, and so the story was very similar. All the good and the great in these two clubs on either side of the Atlantic formed within a couple of weeks of each other. After Rhodes's early death in 1902, his secret society came to be known as the Milner Group, and it was through Lord Milner that the Rothschilds proceeded to cast one of history's largest shadows on the world. Separately, just 7 years before the Milner and Morgan Group's establishment, and just 10 months after Karl Marx's death, a splinter group of the Scottish-American socialist Thomas Davidson's club was established, and it was called the Fabian Society. Fabians were socialists who recognized two things about Marxism: that its economic theories were complete and utter nonsense, so that it would only ever be a political movement, and that attempts to introduce socialism by revolution were destined to fail, so that what they called gradualism was required. That was the motivation for the choice of the name, which was a reference to the successful delaying tactics of the consul and sometime dictator of the Roman Republic, Quintus Fabius Maximus, who during the Second Punic War had very successfully deployed such delaying tactics against the Carthaginians under Hannibal. The Fabian Society would be a low-profile, semi-secret organization gradually infiltrating society at every level to promote socialist thinking on a global basis. Included in their socialist thinking was that the world should come under the governance of a new world order, a global socialist dictatorship with technocratic characteristics. Their funding came not in the main from annual membership fees, as you would expect a good socialist organization to do, but from prolific commercial magnates and financiers, including the houses of Rockefeller, Carnegie, Rothschild, Astor, Waldorf, Balfour, Cadbury, and even Tata Group from India, and many others. And such elite funding of the spawn of Fabianism continues apace to this very day. With overlapping funding, interests, and memberships, the scene was set for the Milner and Morgan groups and the Fabian Society to embark on a largely silent but incredibly successful campaign to change the world. Logically, the first sector targeted by this campaign was education in the United Kingdom, and with astonishing pace, the Fabians infiltrated and quickly controlled the London School Board, key colleges at Oxford University, the University of Glasgow, and others, and they had established the London School of Economics as quickly as 1895. The LSE would go on to very quickly attract notable students, including people like John F. Kennedy and David Rockefeller himself. Bertrand Russell and Clement Attlee and Joseph Schumpeter had taught there, and it very quickly became notorious as the global hotbed of socialist teaching. Women's and youth groups followed, and already by 1897, I mean, that's amazing, just 2 years after its establishment, Beatrice Webb, who was a foundational Fabian Society actor, was not exaggerating when she said that no young woman or man who wanted to study or work in public affairs in the UK could avoid coming under Fabian influence. And so it would go, through arts and culture, through architecture, theater, media houses, trade unions, and churches around the world. Church infiltration is one that has staggered me. They did it so well, which is quite something, because Fabians were typically downright hostile to faith of any kind, religion of any kind. And they equally infiltrated Masonic lodges and movements such as Theosophy, which was quite big at the time. Political infiltration did not take long, and the creation of the predecessor of Britain's Labour Party was quite quick, and by 1924, they had a UK Prime Minister in the form of Ramsay MacDonald. And since then, the total has risen to 9, including Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, Tony Blair, a very big one, Gordon Brown, and the current Keir Starmer, who spoke at the Fabian convention immediately prior to taking office. But this statistic of 9 understates the influence the Fabian Society's financiers had wrought, because over the same period they'd also infiltrated the Liberal Party, steadily steering them away from their sort of more natural domain of civil rights and protections for the individual against the state, and towards simple, bog-standard advocacy of free international trade. This was something that suited the emergence of transnational monopolies, of course, and oligopolies, whose power could be wielded against national governments. The word for this is, of course, globalization. Elsewhere, Australia has had a Fabian Prime Minister for more than half the time over the last half century, and from India to Nigeria to Singapore, every place has had its term. Even in the US, Bill Clinton, with his advocacy of third-way policies, and Barack Obama both stank to high heaven of Fabian socialist influence. And what all these statesmen had in common, of course, was that they never once mentioned the Fabian Society in their election manifestos. That's real gradualism for you. But all of this was nothing compared to the infiltration of the permanent bureaucracies of the world, the so-called deep states. Those organizations, though organizations that you likely haven't heard of, such as Common Purpose, the implementation arm of gradualism, now active in 200 cities worldwide and counting alumni from a staggering 22,000 institutions worldwide. And South Africa's got a similar one called Diversity with a capital T. Whilst common purpose and diversity may lack links to the Fabian Society, their overlapping funders and membership and policy make it sheer folly to reject a connection. And such organizations have been as adept at amassing funding from large corporations as they have been at concealing the fact that they act to project Fabian notions onto the organizations they purport to serve with their so-called leadership and training programs. Geopolitical shaping by this financial elite has been particularly intense and has included fomenting and funding, sometimes on both sides, such events as close to home as the Anglo-Boer War. The Russian Revolution was another example. The First and Second World Wars were other examples, funded on both sides. And many other conflicts are characterized by this. In the same way that the Milner and Morgan groups emerged in lockstep on both sides of the Atlantic, international affairs organizations were spawned by the same financiers. In the UK, it was the Royal Institute for International Affairs, otherwise known as Chatham House. And in the US, it was the Council for Foreign Relations. And both of these had predecessor organizations that were founded just 1 year apart in the wake of World War I. These groups wasted no time forming and populating the League of Nations and began working on the United Nations as an instrument of world government. No fewer than 40 Council for Foreign Relations members attended the 1945 meeting where the UN Charter was drafted. The influence was intense. The same people saw to the formation of secret talk shops, such as the Trilateral Commission and the rather sinister Bilderberg Group. MI6 was a Milnerite creation, and its American station set up the predecessor of the CIA. Most CIA directors have been Council for Foreign Relations members ever since. Later, Mossad would be organized along MI6 and CIA lines under the influence of very similar people. And they also set up the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, which were to preside over the debt traps into which governments all over the world would be forced so as to deliver comprehensive control over their domestic policies to international finance. If you haven't read the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, I strongly remember that you pick it up and read it. It's a very readable book. And these organizations, in turn, would set about sculpting a great many second-order organizations, such as the World Economic Forum, indeed, which tells you to your face that you will own nothing and be happy. And they would elevate some of the creepiest people, total constructs, really, into high position. Even Jeffrey Epstein would make his way into the Trilateral Commission at the behest of David Rockefeller. As an aside, the less damning half of the Epstein files that have actually been shown to the public contain no fewer than 5,500 references to just one Rothschild, Ariane de Rothschild, the atheist head of the continental branch of the Rothschild family. So we're dealing with some really sick puppies here. In short, through constant and massive funding and multi-generational consistency of objectives, Fabianization of the Western world is all but complete, and an argument can be made that considerable progress has been made in the rest of the world too. Now, if some of this hasn't been enough to make your hair stand on end, I'd like to look at some of the policies that Fabians have pursued. You can decide whether you see signs of them here or abroad. Multiculturalism, transformation, DEI, inclusive capitalism, the Ismailization of Europe and anti-white pressure groups such as Black Lives Matter, erosion of custodial arrangements for public securities, a very important and undiscussed topic, lobbying to favor large corporations over small, fear projection to persuade populations into accepting infringement of rights, and assaults on the nuclear family and traditional gendered roles. The capacity to disrupt nations that did not fall in line with these policies received completely prodigious funding. The CIA and MI6 funded and trained Afghanistan elements that would go on to become Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and the Kosovo liberation argument that was instrumental in NATO's bombing of Serbia. And they ultimately perfected the deployment of so-called color revolutions, of which there have been more than a dozen in the last half century in places as diverse as Ukraine, Georgia, and Iran, and so on. To illustrate how pervasively the Anglo-American establishment supervenes over South Africa, I wanted to quickly take a look at just one sector: energy. On top of it all, we had, I should say, because he's passed away now, Sir Evelyn de Rothschild, governor of the London School of Economics for 42 years, driving the translation of climate science into economic imperative. And with Edmund de Rothschild Asset Management making a 26 billion euro commitment to net zero alignment, as they call it, bringing the muscle into that initiative. And here's how it gets local. Listen to this. In the restructuring of Eskom's mountain of debt, Rothschild & Co. advised the creditors, while Lazard Limited, an historically Rothschild allied and principal bank of the Anglo-American establishment, advises Eskom itself. How convenient. This restructuring was a precondition for accessing funding for South Africa's so-called just energy transition, the single largest climate finance deal directed at any developing country in the world. Martin Kingston mentioned several times this conference. The executive chairman of Rothschild & Co. also chairs B4SA, which is the implementation arm of BUSA, Business Unity South Africa, which handles relationships with the government, as well as the Resource Mobilization Fund, which deploys its own staffers in fields like energy modeling, tariff design, legal communications, and energy policy experts into the president's NECOM apparatus. So Rothschilds & Co. are simultaneously advising National Treasury, which decides whether Eskom will assume debt or who will assume Eskom's debt, advising on Eskom's restructuring, which determines the structure of the energy market, advising on Transnet, which transports the coal or would do so, representing creditors in Eskom's debt reorganization, which determines the terms of the unbundling. In short, NUMS is entirely right when they say that the Rothschilds have almost complete control over the process that is forcing South Africa down the catastrophically expensive lark of renewable energy under the banner of the climate crisis scam. We're talking about a level of state capture here that is enough to make even a Gupta blush. And these guys are laughing all the way to the bank at our considerable expense. Because all of this will ensure that instead of utilizing abundant and cheap coal to secure the energy independence that South Africa enjoyed during the apartheid era, South Africa will instead emerge over-indebted, energy-starved, even more dependent on the Anglo-American establishment, and with a national government that is, in all matters of importance, manipulated by foreign interests. With time in hand, I'd explore the motives and purposes of such elaborate and extensive control, but suffice it to say that it is not exerted in the interests of ordinary people of any culture, creed, or ethnicity. And on that very pleasant thought, I'll end by thanking you for allowing me to cheer you up today. I look forward to your intense barrage of questions. Thank you very much.
This BizNews production is brought to you by Brenthurst Wealth, a multi-award winning, truly independent boutique wealth manager. Invest better with Brenthurst.